Hey everybody, how are you guys doing today? This is Jim from the Pain PT. Thank you for being here. I appreciate all of you. If you enjoy the video, I always appreciate likes. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do. You'll get alerted when new videos pop. And today we're going to talk about what's called the contraction bias. Okay, contraction bias. And the reason why I want to talk about this today is this relates to your perception. And I think the brain's perception with these chronic sensations and chronic symptoms is absolutely vital to understand and to shift in terms of your recovery. So the contraction bias is something that they discovered over 100 years ago, discovered in 1910 through an old study. I'm going to talk about this here today. So what happens here with this contraction bias is that we need to understand how sensory information that's coming in from our environment or even coming in from our receptors in our body, whether that be sight, taste, touch, smell, sound, movement, proprioception, kinesthesia, all the stuff that could come in to your system that goes to your brain through your nervous system, how that sensory information is integrated, related to our prior experiences. And there's a connection here. So your memories, what you've been through before, what you've learned, okay, the brain has formed associations, it's formed memories, it has beliefs that are deep in that unconscious brain. And that past that lives in our brain now, combined with sensory information coming in now, can cause your brain to react, to distort, and to potentially perceive inaccurately what's going on. And a lot of your symptoms that you're feeling, these somatic sensations where there isn't anything wrong in your body, can be this, can be an inaccurate representation. It's not telling you the truth. There's nothing wrong. You hear me say this over and over again. There's nothing wrong with you. I'm going to show you a couple studies today that prove how your brain can get it wrong. Okay, so this contraction bias, what we found years ago, 110 years ago, was basically describing a process by which your memory of the magnitude of a stimulus is biased towards the average of past observations. So again, if you've had multiple years, months of pain and it's associated with certain things or symptoms and they come up around this or they're triggered by that, the brain has formed association and memory around that. And that can distort, amplify, or create more symptoms now. So with the study, what they found here, and I'll share with you two studies that really share how this works in your brain. So one of these studies that shows you the contraction bias is if a person is shown multiple different balls, okay, different size balls that vary in size from small to large, okay, the person will form a perception. Again, that word perception is so important. Form a perception of an average size ball in their body. So again, the brain is shown all different sizes. The brain is going to consolidate in the mind and form an average size ball. That's what the brain remembers. Then when the person is asked to judge the size of a particular ball, they will underestimate the size of a larger than average ball. And at the same time, they'll overestimate the size of a smaller than average ball because the brain has learned biased memory and is consolidated into this understanding and belief and perception. So the brain actually either amplifies the size or decreases the size, and that's just a perception. Okay. So what happens is in real life, it says this contraction bias may help to improve our estimation of objects in environments where incoming information is noisy or incomplete. Now, again, it's not always accurate, right? So it's relying upon previous knowledge to give a best guesstimate of the size. For example, they say here that if the ball was only seen for a short time, very short time, or a long time ago, it may prove useful to rely on our previous knowledge of the ball size to give a best guess estimate of the size. So the brain guesses, the brain predicts, it's called predictive coding. The brain spits out instantly some reaction based on, again, the calculation that comprises your past experiences, your memories, your beliefs, everything you've been through combined with the present moment. kicks out sort of an answer or output. And again, as you're seeing here in the studies, it can overestimate or underestimate that and actually inaccurately kick out stuff. And this is exactly what we see with chronic pain and chronic symptoms, is an inaccurate output from the brain. It doesn't mean that much. Okay, we give this a lot of meaning. We think that means so much. We're strengthening that connection. We're strengthening that pain or that symptom. So again, they've been doing a lot more studies since, 110 years ago. They're doing more studies on this now to see what part of your brain is working here. And what they found here more recently is that the cortical brain, which I talk a lot about that prefrontal cortex, but this is a part of your brain called the posterior parietal cortex, still part of your cortical brain. And this one doctor, Dr. Akrami, he did a more recent experiment using rats to look at this contraction bias again of an auditory stimulus. Now, again, the stimulus could be anything, some information coming in from the chair you're sitting on, or bending over with your back, or eating a food, or a smell, or a taste, or a chemical, or a touch, right? Anything could be coming in and could be basically distorted by your brain or misconstrued or overreacted or underreacted. So in this study with the rats, what they did was the rats were trained to distinguish between two tones, two sounds that were played sequentially and different in how loud they were. Okay, so the rats were trained to report whether they perceived the first or the second sound as the louder one. If they perceived the first sound as louder, they would place their nose in a small hole on the left. If they perceived the second sound as louder, they would place their nose in a small hole on the right. Okay, and if they got the task correct, they would get a reward. So to make the task more difficult for the rats, there was a delay of several seconds between the first and the second sound, meaning the rat had to hold in its memory the magnitude of the sound, of the loudness of the sound of the first tone, and then compare it to the second one that came. The rats underwent many trials, one after the other, and Dr. Akrami demonstrated that the estimation of the first tone, which was being held in the rat's memory, was biased towards the average volume of the previous trial. So again, the brain came in and averaged this to something that was an average of everything. And again, this is what we have seen in studies on contraction bias in humans as well. Okay. Furthermore, it was shown that the previous two trials affected the rat's performance in the most, while longer-term history had a smaller but appreciable effect. So again, what you've been through before and over again with the pain being triggered or the symptoms being triggered has an effect now in the present moment. And that's from the memory, that's from the learning that the brain has acquired. And just like we heard before, where it overestimates or underestimates the size of the balls, the same thing happened here, okay, with the sounds. They had similar results, okay? And Dr. Akrami wanted to see where in the brain does this contraction bias originate. Again, found out it's in the PPC, the posterior parietal cortex, okay, cortical lobe of your brain, frontal lobe, receives input from your visual, auditory, somatosensory regions. And that part of your brain is thought to be important in integrating, okay, the inputs that come in with short-term memory. So again, we got memory. We're talking about memory today, inputs coming in, and then the perception the brain has in the output. Okay. So what they could do in rats, we can't do this in humans yet, is they could inhibit some of these neurons in that part of the brain by shining a light on it. It's called optogenetics. And they were able to switch that off during this experiment. And what they found was that when the PPC part of your brain was switched off during the experiment, the ability of the rats to distinguish which stimulus was louder or which sound was louder, it improved. So they had a more accurate representation, okay, because the contraction bias was no longer taking place. All right, they were no longer influenced by previous trials. Mm-hmm. So think of previous trials of symptoms, previous trials of your pain, how that could impact your brain, and then have a contraction bias now in the present, how that might be shaping your brain to overestimate more pain or to overreact potentially to something, or to predict the situations where a pain may start up again in what we call predictive coding. So I think this is really important to understand because it shows that the brain actually uses memory and what it's learned, and that influences how it perceives the present moment. And many times, like I said, it gets it wrong. The brain is calculating some type of average here, and then it's going to interpret a sound or any stimulus the size of a ball or a touch. They've done other studies on this as well, where they put touch on people's backs, and people who have had a lot of chronic pain in their back, they are overestimating the amount of force on their back. So they're inaccurately thinking that there's way more pressure that the person's putting on their back. And in reality, the pressure is quite light. So the brain typically overestimates here when it comes to chronic symptoms. It's also called sensitization. The brain gets sensitized, so it overreacts to normal stimuli. We need to understand this. We need to take this to heart to realize that many times the pain we're feeling or the symptom we're feeling, the intensity is not really indicating much, especially with chronic conditions. Acute conditions are different. If you have an injury or something like that, the pain typically matches the level of injury or strain or sprain or illness in the body. But it's not the case for chronic pain. There's a distortion here that's happening because of memory. So I hope this makes sense, everybody. I like to bring in the neuroscience, bring in some of this understanding here. And today we're talking about what's called the contraction bias in the brain. And this can relate also to your situation, your pain and your symptoms. If you guys like this video, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel. If you're looking for more help, I offer coaching. I talked about this contraction bias today in my daily audios. So I offer daily audios about 10 minutes a day, maybe a little more, every day of the week that goes out to people to keep them on track, to remind them, to reassure them of what this is, what we're doing, some of the strategies. You can dial up individual sessions with me, one-to-one or group sessions. As we enter the new year, I'm going to be offering more selection of group sessions to offer more practical approaches that you guys can integrate into changing your brain, rewiring your brain, neuroplasticity here to shift ourselves into a more healthy, normal, accurate brain. Okay, everybody. Thank you so much. Appreciate all of you, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.